Welcome to the Locum Strategist podcast. I'm your host, Simon Parsons, and this is the show where we help physicians take control of their skill set and create a life on your own terms by using Locum Tenens work. Today, I have a very special guest who is also my friend. He's been doing Locum Tenens with me since 2015, but after that, he ended up becoming a trauma medical director in Lake Havasu, and now he hires locums to come help out at his facility. We were just jamming on a call before this, and I thought it'd be fun to get him on this podcast so we could talk a little bit about some of the perspective shifts that he's had since he's done locums, but also as somebody who hires. Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks for having me on today. It's going to be fun to talk about locums.
Oh, you and I go way back, don't we?
We do. It seems like 100 years.
Well, you're somebody that I consider a good friend, and I'm so glad that we've maintained our relationship. I think we started doing locums back in about 2015, and it's been fun to see all of your success. And I always love that we rely on each other for perspective and advice. The question I have for you to start out with is I wanted to hear a little bit more about your backstory. Walk me through your career as a surgeon from when you first started, why you decided to go down this path, and then where you are right now. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, I trained in Chicago at Loyola and became the youngest trauma fellow ever at Loyola University, which is kind of cool. In fact, I was the first one, and for a decade, the only one they ever had. So I did trauma out there with some of the original old school trauma physicians, both in Chicago and in Kentucky. And right after my training, I started up a trauma center immediately. In fact, I started running the trauma center before I finished my residency, which was probably couldn't be done again today. So I started I started a trauma center from scratch in 1992. I had no idea what I was doing. We got lucky. We started the program up and it did pretty well in Chicago. And from there, I started up another trauma center in Phoenix and then revamped another one in Arizona. So I've always been related to trauma centers at the administrative level.
And then when did you decide to do locums work, and what was the impetus behind that?
I think I started doing locums work when I was in Phoenix. When I was in Phoenix, I started to do some locums work. It was primarily initially to supplement my income because at that point in time, I was working at a university, which is the only time I've done my career at a university. The bulk of it's been in private trauma centers. So I basically didn't know much about it, did it to supplement my income, and then sporadically did it up until just probably a year or two ago.
Tell me a little bit more about what you and I did together. I recall that we did something up in South Dakota for a while, but the bulk of our relationship, you were working part-time in Arizona, but then we had you flying out to Panama City. Is that right?
Yeah, we started up in up north, but then we did the bulk of it was in Panama City and plus also in southern Texas. So there was months, probably for a year or two, that I was doing something in Arizona, something in Florida, and then something in Texas virtually almost every month.
What is the difference between working in a private practice or for a hospital versus doing locums? I think it was McAllen, Texas, where you were working. And then you also were helping out Panama City, both pretty busy level 2 centers. But tell me a little bit about the differences between being either employed or a practice versus being a locum tenens.
I think the difference may come down to your location or the experience, because when I was in Texas, I kind of felt like a second class surgeon or citizen, whereas in Panama, I felt a little bit less like that. But you may remember I also did a little bit of work in Tulsa. And that's where I think I learned the most about what it's like to be a real locums, in which it's kind of hard to describe. I think if you can go to a place in which they treat you like you're a staff member, then the locums thing kind of goes away. The locums term, I think, it's kind of got a bad rap to it in some respects. Because I think some people think you're locums and you're there as a hired gun and you're just there for a short period of time. Whereas I think the experience about being in another city, in another place, depends on how they treat you and how you treat them. So I'm not sure if that really comes across, but I think the locums experience is, at the end of the day, you're still doing surgery, you're doing medicine, you're taking care of patients. It's just a question of how you're interfaced and how you're linked with that hospital. Are you going to be welcome with open arms like one of their staff members and have had that experience? Or are you going to be kind of like a second-class citizen? And I've had that experience too. And it basically probably makes sense for the hospital and the physicians there to treat you like one of their own, because that's when someone like me, the locums, wants to keep going back. That's when you get, I think, better patient care. I think you're treated better and you're going to have a much longer relationship with that hospital. I mean, I was probably in Panama for 2 or 3 years or more.
Do you have any influence over that? I think like when I first started doing recruiting for locum tenens, there was kind of a stigma around it. And you had some of these older physicians that maybe looked down as far as locums, but I feel like, especially in the last several years, there's been such a boom and such an openness. And I feel like there's a lot of people who have left the practice or hospital employment because they felt like they were being pushed too far. And now they embrace the locum tenens lifestyle. And I think that they've also been the people who have shored up some of the needs, the gaps that were left from the people leaving employment. But as somebody who does locums, how do you help shape that? As somebody who is, if you were working in a place and somebody would, you've kind of got that vibe that you were looked down on a little bit as a second class citizen. What do you have? What can you take control of as far as shaping that?
You mean on the locum side or the person who's employing them side?
I want to ask you about both, but let's start with the locum side. So you get
Oh,
hired on and you're in a facility and you're not feeling like you're part of the team. You're not feeling as integrated as possible. Is there anything that you can think of that you would do? And maybe you're talking to yourself, your current version of you talking back to an older version of yourself back in 2015. You go to a hospital and you don't feel like you're being very well integrated. What advice would you give yourself as far as changing that?
well, you could make it what you want it to be. So if you just show up, they barely talk to you, you just do your shifts, then you've participated in making yourself feel that way. But what I learned is I've gone down to some of these locations, then I've offered to give lectures because education is highly sought after by surgeons or other physicians to the nurses and the paramedics. So I've offered to give lectures. I think the other big thing is ask and almost insist that you participate in the monthly or weekly meetings. So you kind of become more than just the person taking call. Do whatever you can, integrate yourself into that community. And that again is maybe you walk around and you make rounds in the morning, go to the ER, say hi, get to know some of the staff members, ask to go to the monthly meetings, like trauma has meetings all the time. Most trauma surgeons, I'm talking about trauma right now, but it applies to anybody. Most physicians have canned lectures already prepared, and hospitals need those lectures. So it's not a big deal to go to another hospital and say, hey, I've got a lecture on blunt force trauma, some great videos. Would you like me to give it? So once you integrate yourself that way, I think it goes a long way than just taking call.
I love that you mentioned that because I think that it's about being engaged, right? So instead of just being passive and showing up and waiting for things to come to you, what you're talking about is taking the initiative and being a little bit more outgoing and finding ways that you can add value. So my next question is about networking. So you've done really well with networking, and it's interesting because you made some connections at some of the places that you worked with, and you've maintained those connections. And as far as I know, you've got a few of them doing locums with you through me, which is really interesting to see. So, with your lens of somebody who has done locums before, how does that shape you on the other side of that as somebody who brings locums in? And then tell me a little bit about some of the people that you've worked with in the past and how you now use them as far as helping you out with locum staffing at your current facility.
Well, it's a small community. So you pointed out the fact that I've worked with a number of surgeons. When I was doing locums, they were doing locums. So they were on staff potentially at another hospital. Got to know them really well. We became friends. And now I'm employing them in my facility in Arizona. So I think you got to recognize it's a small community. whether it's the people doing locums or just the surgeons in general. Everybody gets to know each other. And I go back to one other point about the networking issue. And here's a question for you. So a trick would be like, I want to really go to a specific hospital. And when I get down there, I'm going to probably offer, hey, I got 5 presentations. Here they are. Pick which ones you want. I've also been a trauma director before, or I've had a role at the state level. I've done something. Can you utilize that? But I guess the question is, does it make sense before the locums physician? Let's say I wanted to go to Iowa. Does it make sense for me to go to my counterpart, which is you, and say, hey, when you promote me to Iowa, can you also say he's willing to give lectures, here's his topics, he's been part of the trauma society, he's been on a committee, he'd like to actually participate in your meetings. I guess the question is for you, does that help steer the decision to pick amongst myself and another locums candidate?
Absolutely. That's such a good question. I think that ultimately the recruiter's responsibility is to handle some marketing. So if a hospital, you've been on the other end of that now. So you've opened up jobs in Havasu where you get probably overwhelmed with different CVs. And there's a part of it where the recruiter, whether they're the liaison for the hospital or for the physician, needs to filter some stuff out and bring to your attention what is most important. But my job as a physician recruiter is to highlight the person that I work with and make sure that they don't come across as just another CV. There's always a person behind that. There's always a story behind that. And I think that is extremely valuable, what you mentioned, for a couple of reasons. I think that it helps the physician stand out as a candidate, but also it's showing that you have a way to add value that goes above and beyond most other physicians. Now, another thing that I would mention is it's a good idea to network with some of the other locums or physicians that you're working with, because they can also become referrals for you or give you a recommendation or a testimonial. They can help out if you're credentialing in a new hospital. And it's been really fun seeing the relationships that you've built with some of the trauma surgeons that you worked with in the past several years ago that now reunited and work with you at your current hospital. I want to know this too. You said that doing locums has shaped how you treat the locums that you bring in. So now that you're the person who's directing the trauma center, what are some of the things that you are doing to take care of the locums that come work for you?
Well, the backstory to that is I still remember, I won't mention what hospital, but it was in Florida, and I showed up to do locums on a Saturday, and the hospital was totally unprepared. I didn't have a badge. There was no one there to show me how to get into the computer system. There was a discrepancy between me and another trauma surgeon who was actually taking call. It was kind of a mess. That was logistically straightened. That got straightened out pretty quickly. But that first week there, I did feel like a second-class citizen. I had no idea what their protocols were. I had no idea basically where the bathrooms were, how to get scrubs. So I think from that, I'm like, there's got to be a better way. So I've experienced places since then in which things were done differently. But at our place, what I've done is to take that knowledge and created more of a welcome environment. I make sure that when the locums come to our facility, they get their own keys to our call room. They have their own charging cord they can take back to the hotel for our phones. We created a 3-ring binder that has every one of our policies in it, in our guidelines, but we just don't hand it to them. I sit down with them every morning when they first get there, and we go through each guideline and each policy one by one so that they understand what it's about. We try to make them feel welcome. We take them on a tour of the hospital. They basically get the exact same treatment as a full-time brand new employee would. So I think it's how you treat them, because maybe there's a selfish reason to do it. We've had almost 100% of the people that have come to my place over the past 4 or 5 years ask to come back or want to come back. I think because of the way they were treated at the beginning. So it makes it so much easier than having to look for new people every month. So yeah, I think it was a selfish way to treat people nicely. Everybody benefits from it.
I love that you did that. It makes me so happy. And I hope that there's some more decision makers or hospitals who are doing what you were doing and using locums. But I hope they hear this, because I think what I'm getting out of this conversation is just it's so important to get out of your own shoes and into the shoes of the hospital staff or the decision maker, or maybe the recruiter, and see things through their eyes, because I truly believe that we can all elevate this game if we take some time to understand the people that we're working with. My next question for you, I'm gonna wrap this up in just a sec, but I got two really good questions for you, Chris. So if you were to give advice to a younger version of yourself, let's say you were just starting out your career and you hadn't even done your first assignment, now knowing what you do, being on both sides of that coin, what type of advice would you give a younger version of yourself?
Well, it's kind of a general question, but I do like what one of the locums is doing that I'm working with, and I think maybe he's gone to an extreme. There's so much discourse in medicine right now. People who are employed feel like, they're beholden to one person above them. They make the wrong step, they can get fired the next day. And if you get fired the next day, you potentially are not going to find a job for 9 months to a year in the medical field. So it's an interesting thought to have a blend for some people. Maybe you get a full-time job and you do locums. Locums supplement your income. Locums is your backup. Locums allows you to get perspective from a different way of doing medicine. So if I had to do this all over again, I would probably do that as a blend. I think maybe if you can maybe work one weekend a month or 3 days a month, doesn't have to be every month, but if you have a finger in another position somewhere else, I think it's really important for job security. You just don't know what's going to happen in the medical field. Medicine is now unbalanced. It used to be a balance of church and state. A physician 20 years ago could have walked into the CEO's office of a single hospital and talked one-on-one as equals. But now we've gone the complete opposite. We have conglomerates of hospitals that may have 300 or 400 hospitals. The CEO reports to the CEO that reports to the CEO. The physicians are no longer, for the most part, independent anymore. They're now become employees. So the balance of power is totally out of whack. And the downside is it could wreck your family. And I don't mean to downplay this, but let's say you worked at a fast food restaurant and you got fired. You could probably go down a block to the other fast food restaurant and find another job within a day or two. In medicine, if you lose your job, unfortunately, with licensing, and now we have these large conglomerates that might sort of blackball you, it can affect your family if you lose your job with one small mistake at one hospital. So I think there's a lot of reasons to do locums. It could be to supplement your income, which is the way I started out. Now I think it's a great way to offset the balance of power, to give you some stability in case something happens at your primary job. And one of the docs I work with, that's all he's doing is locums. You know him. He's a great guy. He likes to have the autonomy to go to different places. But like me, he doesn't want one entity over his head or her head dictating their future.
I think that's such a great point. I think that's good advice for anybody. COVID was a perfect example of that. Hospitals shut down for several months. Now, that may not have changed things for a locum tenens, but for me, it made me realize the importance of having a backup plan, having some type of an insurance policy. But I also think that, to your point, working in a different hospital can also give you so many different insights, and you really can take advantage of the networking piece of that. My last question for you, my friend, is pretend I wasn't your friend. And I want to hear just straight up truth. Just, I know that you and I've had such a great partnership, but I don't want you to talk about me right now. I want you to tell me what you would be looking for as far as a good recruiter. For somebody who's listening to this podcast who hasn't done locums before or know how to find a good recruiter, what are some of the things that are important to you of finding somebody who can take good care of you when it comes to doing locums, a good partner, so to speak, when it comes to finding a rep?
Well, you hadn't teed that question up, but I was trying to figure out how to bring that question to the fold, because the one thing you did, so I will toot your own horn, you probably are still doing this. You created a one-page slick about me. with my photo, you add me, I think I added some stuff about my background. It wasn't all about medicine, or some other things that were in there. I have never, ever, ever met a company or a person, recruiter, that has done that. And I've talked to a lot of other physicians. I'm like, go talk to this recruiter because he has this one-page slick, and they're like, I've never seen that before either. So it's interesting how that personal touch makes a difference. And the funny thing is, it's gotten even more important. I don't go a day without getting text messages about a job somewhere, and I never talked to that recruiter ever before. So I think the recruiter has to be personable, make the physician or nurse, what the position is, feel like they're very important. And I do think that something different, that one-page summary was, I don't mean to highlight it so much, but it was so cool to see that. And it probably made a difference when you promoted me to hospitals.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm glad you brought that up. And what he's referring to is just some of the internal marketing that I do. And I do believe that as a recruiter, that's your job, is to look out to really understand the physician. That maybe this is the way that I would translate what you're talking about is I believe a physician recruiter should have the ability to really know who you're working with on both ends, right? So I need to know you more than just your CV. I need to be able to paint that picture for you to help people understand what it is that makes you different and what it is that makes you go above and beyond, and how to add value. So I think that I love that you mentioned that, because it goes hand in hand with what you were talking about before, about, how do you have your recruiter let a potential client know the value that you're going to bring. So the personal touch, and then just also really understanding that there is a person behind that CV, and that as a recruiter, it's our job to help us share that story.
I agree. It's gotten even this business has gotten very impersonal. The amount of emails or text messages from people I have no idea who they are, who've never bothered to talk. Not that I'm looking for any more positions, but the personal thing is really going to make that recruiter stand out compared to all the noise that's out there now.
Well, I appreciate our friendship, and this was a fun pop-up episode. Again, for the audience, Chris and I go way back, and it's, we bounce ideas off each other that go far beyond locums work, and I consider him a strong ally to me, to my company, but to physicians in general. He really does such a great job with standing up for physicians and helping you live an empowered life. Thank you so much for joining me today, Chris.
Thanks for having me. It's cool. We're a lot of fun.